Welcome to the SoothSight Podcast. I'm Christopher Dole, and it is my pleasure to be joined today by the internationally lauded economist, scholar, lawyer, and writer, Julian Morris. He holds 3 master's degrees in economics from prestigious universities such as Cambridge and UCL, as well as graduate law diploma from the University of Westminster. Julian is a globally acclaimed thought leader who has, among other things, worked as an econometrician, professor, editor, and researcher focused on economics, law, finance, and policy. Today, he works with 2 of the most prestigious think tanks on earth, Reason Foundation, where he is a senior fellow, and the International Center for Law and Economics, where he is a senior scholar. Julian is also on the board of several nonprofits and is involved with a number of early-stage businesses. One of those businesses is Euler Digital, the parent company of AI Forum, a B2B platform that uses AI to communicate about AI, as well as AI Gen, which seeks to empower youth to make AI fun, exciting, and educational. Last, but by no means least, he is a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, which was founded in 1754 and counts among its past fellows Charles Dickens, Benjamin Franklin, Stephen Hawking, Karl Marx, and Adam Smith. I think it's safe to say that Julian identifies more closely with Smith than Marx. As an undergraduate at Edinburgh University, Julian also spent time studying artificial intelligence and tells me he wrote a poem generator and Prolog, but says he has had more fun DJing and running acid house clubs. He's still obsessed with music, but sadly doesn't spin the decks any longer. On a personal note, I have been a fan of Julian's work for over a decade. He is brilliant and a fascinating intellectual with the rare ability to explain extremely complex subjects in ways that even a pleb like me can grasp. Julian, thank you for joining us today.
That's an unfair comment on your own perceptions and ability to communicate. I would say that all our conversations have been as peers, and it's been a great pleasure to have known you these years and to have chatted with many different things. So yeah, great pleasure to be on this podcast.
Thank you so much. So you've talked about the history of innovation being encapsulated into, 2 words, fear factor. And I believe you once said something along the lines of, from the days of the horse and buggy to the dawn of driverless vehicles, public misunderstanding and government policies have always preceded and stalled technological advancement. These policies seem predicated on 2 fundamental drivers, so opportunity and fear. And based on the volume or intensity of either, people have propped themselves up as the architects of society and along the way been influenced by special interest. I know you've done a lot of work on the problem of fear-based regulation, which is highly relevant to the public discourse on AI. So just wondering, can you elaborate on these drivers and talk about how you see policies being implemented based on sentiment over, let's say, sound fundamental strategies?
I think one good way of looking at it is using the phrase Baptists and bootleggers. That was coined by an economist, now very well-known economist, Bruce Yandell, who was a chief economist at the Federal Trade Commission. And while he was there, he saw that very often regulation was being pushed by both vested interests and by ideologues. And he used the analogy of Baptists and bootleggers because similarly, in dry states or dry towns in the South where he was from, he noted that there would often be a Baptist minister who would push for maintaining dry Sundays. Now, the Baptist minister himself probably has an interest in this because if people aren't going out and getting drunk, they're more likely to attend church. At the same time, though, there were clear beneficiaries of a more insidious kind, namely the people making moonshine, the bootleggers, who would be the only ones selling their liquor on a Sunday. And so you had this at least tacit, and sometimes it was an explicit coalition of Baptists on the one hand, who said, oh, liquor's bad, want to ban it, and bootleggers who said, well, we want to sell liquor. So the only way we're going to do that is if the legal suppliers aren't able to supply it. So we want it banned on Sundays. So Baptist Bootlegger Coalition. And he used that as an analogy to explain environmental regulation, which often was being driven both by environmental groups that may have legitimate concerns about the possible effects of a certain chemical or a certain type of activity on the environment. At the same time, firms that are currently in the market and producing goods might demand regulation because they know that it'll exclude smaller players. So you have a famous example of the restrictions that were placed on chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which, so in 1985, countries around the world gathered together and they negotiated the Vienna Convention on ozone depleting chemicals. That convention created a kind of schedule for phasing out CFCs on the legitimate premise that CFCs were causing harm to the ozone layer and depleting it, which was going to lead possibly to dramatic problems in terms of extra ultraviolet radiation hitting the earth and causing crop damage and sunburns and all sorts. Anyway, so problems, there was a legitimate problem, and a solution had been sort of put in place. Now, between 1985 and 1987, manufacturers of CFCs realized that they could develop and patent, certain manufacturers of CFCs, I won't name names, but realized they could develop and did develop and patented alternatives. Having developed and patented an alternative, they were then in favor of phasing out the CFCs more rapidly, because they knew that they would be able to sell their patented alternatives at much higher prices than they were currently able to sell their out of patent alternatives, and they pushed very hard for an increase in the rate at which the ozone depleting CFCs would be eliminated, and got that in place in what's called the Montreal Protocol. Now, we all probably more familiar with the Montreal Protocol than we are the Vienna Convention, but it was the Vienna Convention that started all that, and then got taken over by vested interests. So a kind of classic example of a Baptist bootlegger coalition. There are many others. So I mean, long story short, that this is often the driver of regulation. So even when there may be a justification for some kind of regulation, you often get the regulation itself is not ideal, if you like.
So to that point, then the market is only as free as the policies that are governing it. And so do you think that AI will create more freedom or restrictions? And as a result, who is impacted? And moreover, are you concerned that the fear of AI will result in harmful regulation that will impede the development of technology and even prohibit the evolution in ways that will provide maximum benefits?
So I think one of the problems is conceiving of AI as a discrete technology that requires sui generis regulation, whereas the reality is that AI has been around for decades and has been implemented by all sorts of different companies, and your own company being at the forefront over the course of the past decade. But I mean, going back to the 1980s, payment companies were using machine learning systems to help identify fraud. Early neural nets, actually. So they were one of the first businesses to be implementing that form of AI. If you'd had an AI regulation at the time, would they have been prevented in implementing that technology because it might have somehow been biased or discriminatory or something? So I think there's a great danger in conceiving of AI as a single technology that needs its own regulation, as opposed to applying more impartial rules that say if something is causing a harm, then then we may be justified in taking action against that harm. But I think trying to create I think predicating regulation on AI is a mistake because of the very, very different nature of the technologies that we're actually talking about.
If we take then a very recent example, the EU's new Digital Service Act is set to regulate big tech companies, mandating them to ensure that online safety is present by curbing the spread of what they deem as harmful content, and talking about punishments up to 6% of a company's global revenue, or even outright bans. So who decides what is harmful or biased, and what is the likely legal and economic impact on data-driven tech companies in both the short and long term? And sorry for the long-winded question, but also how do you prevent the TSA from legally mandating wokeness?
So I mean, there's much to unpack in that, but I mean, I think we can look at some of the recent problems emanating from, for example, GDPR in the EU, which we've got some experience of now. So this was an act intended to kind of protect people's privacy in some way. It gave people actually a right to be forgotten. You could request in the EU that your personal information be removed from the internet under GDPR. It also created issues with regard to the movement of data between Europe and the US. It's an ongoing situation. And it's not clear that it's had any benefits, but it certainly had a lot of costs. So many US-based, smaller US-based web-based enterprises chose not to be available in the EU because of the costs of trying to comply with GDPR. It was cheaper simply to say, no, if you're in the EU, you can't visit this website. Other companies obviously chose to bear those costs, and those costs were in the billions of dollars. And that was actually in some sense a relatively impartial act, because it just said, well, these are the rules. We're going to allow national agencies to determine the precise content, but the rules themselves were somewhat clear. When it comes to the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, I think that there is much greater risk of partial decision making on the part of governments, depending on exactly how they're implemented. But right. So the Digital Markets Act, you've had the EU itself making determinations of, who is a platform that needs to be regulated, apparently, separate from all the other regulations that are already subject to, competition regulations and so on and so forth. So I think there is a tendency in the EU to think that what is needed in every time a problem is identified is a top-down regulation, and increasingly the determination as to who gets to say what the content of that regulation is the European Commission, to some extent the European Parliament, then rubber stamped by the member states, the Council of Ministers. And the result of that is regulations that don't reflect what the consumer really is concerned about. It's so divorced, and there's what's often called a democratic deficit in the EU because legislation is initiated by a bureaucracy, the European Commission. They're not responsive to the people of Europe, and although the Parliament has some power, the Parliament is typically the constituencies of the Parliament are so large that they also have very little connection to the people, and the voter turnout in European Parliament elections is relatively small. So there's a real democratic deficit in the EU, resulting in increasingly restrictive regulations that most likely are driven up again by these sort of Baptist bootlegger coalitions. So in the context of consumer policy making, you have a number of NGOs that are given kind of priority attention in the EU. And at the same time, you have businesses that have a strong voice. And the businesses that have the strongest voice are those that are already domiciled in the EU. businesses outside the EU are kind of second-class citizens. They're not given the same level of attention. So the result is you get regulations that may favour or seem to favour European businesses and are aligned with the interests of a certain narrow group of NGOs, but almost certainly aren't in the sort of global interest, and most likely in most cases are not in the interest of the average citizen in the EU. So that's going to be true with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, and the consequence is that actually you protect European businesses at the cost of international business, with the result that they don't have to compete properly with international business, so they stay stuck in their protected zone, which is an increasingly small part of the global economy. That's actually not going to benefit them in the long run.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And you've written extensively on, let's say, more appropriate regulatory frameworks for various aspects of AI, ranging from legal frameworks for autonomous vehicles to the impact of robotics on the workforce. So how do you then create a regulatory framework that encourages the development of AI in a way that enables humans to benefit the most? So, people, especially, including people that whose contribution to the workforce might be impacted.
So a lot of the work that I've done over the years has really been focused on contrasting bottom-up regulation with top-down regulation. So we've just talked a little bit about top-down regulation in the EU. You have similar top-down regulations in the US emanating from various different agencies, FTC, EPA, and so on. The alternative to top-down regulation is bottom-up regulation. Well, what does that mean? That means the rules, the standards, and informal arrangements that exist between individuals that enable markets to operate and that provide the basic framework for interactions. Most regulation, in some sense, is really bottom up. It's the rules of the game. It's you go into an establishment and it has a list of things that you can or cannot do in that establishment. Those are private rules that have been established by that establishment. If you going back to hundreds of years, if you go back to the Middle Ages, there were things called kind of champagne fairs in Champagne in France, and similar trade fairs in most of Europe, and at these fairs, people would transact. They would buy and sell goods. The governance of those transactions was basically determined by an informal court. They call them in France the pied poudre courts, the dusty foot courts, where you would go in and there would be that you would be agree to the decision of a local eminence who would make a decision there and then as regards your the whether or not the thing that you complained about, whether it was someone stealing your goods or someone not delivering the goods that you'd been promised, and so on. Out of that, and out of a number of other sort of relatively similar informal arrangements, emerged the laws that we now know as kind of the customary common law or civil law laws governing market transactions. And those laws often were ultimately formalized in some way. So you can see statutes, the Universal Commercial Code in the United States, or the Sale of Goods Act in the UK, that reflect those emergent laws that came from decisions that were based on facts and circumstances that pertain to a possibly either legitimate or illegitimate occurrence, and that then led to sort a set of principles that govern the way that people are able to sell items and what they're able to sell, how they're able to sell it, and so on. So I'll give you an example. So if a person has bought a toy at a retailer, and that toy causes some injury to the child to whom it's given, then the person who purchased that toy is able to file a claim against the retailer, who if it's held that the toy itself was defected, will be held liable on the basis that the toy was not fit for consumption. It was not fit for purpose. It wasn't capable of doing what it was supposed to do, but in fact ended up harming someone. That law, that's not from statute. It is now in statute, but it's not from statute. That law emerged hundreds of years ago as a result of these kinds of disputes. And it enables some certainty as to what you are likely to, what you can reasonably expect as a consumer. So that's at the base level, you've got a law in place that makes sense because it relates to the fact of a transaction and the claims that are being made about the good that you're being sold. In addition to that basic legal liability, an individual purchasing a good might see that the good that the manufacturer has also provided a warrant that a good is if it doesn't do what it says it's going to do, then the manufacturer will give you something in return. So you don't need to go to court or anything. You just say, okay, well, it didn't do what it did, what it said it was going to do. Can I have this money back? And unless the manufacturer is fraudulent, that will cover you. If they're fraudulent, then you can go to court and sue them for fraud. So then the next stage, manufacturers have an interest in not harming their consumers, because if they know if they harm their consumers, that will adversely affect their reputation. So in the mid-19th century, there was a legitimate concern about adulterated food in the UK. And a doctor, Dr. Hassel, wrote a series of articles about this in a medical journal, highlighting the dangers of certain kinds of foods which were being sold, preserved goods mostly, that were being sold to people. One of the main manufacturers of these goods in London, a Mr. Blackwell, of Cross and Blackwell, then subsequently gave evidence in Parliament when there was an inquiry into this, saying that he was committed absolutely to removing all these harmful substances from his goods, and he did so. And he established basically farm-to-table standards that ensured that the Cross and Blackwell products weren't harmful to consumers. They removed various chemicals that have been used as preservatives, maybe not understanding that they had adverse effects. They removed those, for example, mercury-based preservatives. It's almost laughable now. We think that what they were using mercury as a preservative is completely mad. But yeah, this was just something that was done in the mid-19th century. And I don't really need to tell you the rest of the story. Cross and Blackwell is still a brand, whereas many of the other manufacturers are no longer around. So by creating standards and communicating them and ensuring that people knew that their products were good, they solved the problem. They enabled consumers to buy the higher quality product and dismiss the lower quality products. And there was fundamentally no need then to establish any further system of regulation of these things. It was done. The private market did it. Unfortunately, the kind of attention to the problem ultimately led to the various acts. I mean, the Safe Safe Food and Drug Act, I think, in the UK, and a similar act in the US that protects consumers, because consumers clearly can't use standards to determine whether or not they're going to be harmed by observing whether a product conforms to standards or not. It's entirely paternalistic and misconceived. Not just because it's obvious that consumers are able to determine whether a product is good or bad based on the reputation of the product manufacturer and the standards that it adheres to, but also because it is simply impossible for a government regulator to know and at each instance that where a product might be defective. So you have this ridiculous disjunct where the reality is that bottom-up standards that are well established and well enforced and applied by companies that have incentives to ensure that they're compliant from farm to table in the case of food manufacturers, whereas the government, health officials, environmental officials, and so on, can only sporadically intervene and don't really understand the production processes and don't have any idea as to what the best standards would be. It's unfortunate that while we are still largely reliant on these bottom-up regulations, these standards and informal rules and so on, the government still thinks that top-down regulations are needed.
If we take a little bit of a different turn here, because I agree with everything you said there for sure, but there obviously the great economist Thomas Sowell, and he talks about 4-year terms for politicians hurting our economy because it takes time for policies to take effect, and as a result they succumb to implementing fast policies to drive metrics for re-election as opposed to taking a long-term, more sustainable approach. So do you agree with his position, and do you see this as a problem impacting AI, and is there a way to fix it?
So Thomas Sowell's a genius, and he made so many other areas as well. He's correct, but in this particular case, he's absolutely spot on. Yes, there's a fundamental problem with the political cycle, which is driven by the interests of politicians to get re-elected and get funding for their election campaigns and so on, rather than by ensuring that the best interests of society are taken into account. And it's a little bit sad to see the United States, as you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from the UK. It's a little bit sad to see the United States, which started out with some great ideas, or was founded on one great idea, but that also encapsulates a number of other great ideas. And that the great idea really is limited government. So and ensuring that first of all, governance occurs at the lowest level possible. That to the extent that you have higher layers of government, they're very constrained, limited in their powers and so on. Unfortunately, the Constitution of the United States contains this thing called the Commerce Clause, which seems like a really good idea to ensure freedom of interstate commerce. It sounds like a sort of free market idea, and it was. Unfortunately, though, it's been used to justify all manner of federal regulation on the premise that in order to have interstate commerce, there needs to be kind of standard regulations across states. And that then is enabled politicians to promulgate federal regulations in such a way as to benefit them in the short to medium term, rather than benefit the wider public. It's also led to a perverse effect where some states, like California, will push for more extreme regulation on the assumption that if they do that, then they have a better bargaining position with vis-a-vis Washington to push for stronger regulation, which ultimately they think will benefit them or the manufacturers in their state. So if manufacturers in California are adapted to Californian regulations, they will be interested in pushing those regulations on everyone else, and they've got a first mover advantage in complying with those regulations. So that's what's happening at the political level. How do you solve it? I mean, reducing the power of the federal government is the ultimate kind of mechanism for that, and I think that becomes in kind of high contrast when you look at. So I'm using a photographer's term. It's blatant, right? So it's black and white, monochrome. It's that with the almost exponential increase in the rate of innovation that has happened over the course of the past few decades, and will happen increasingly as a result of AI. There is this total disconnect between the political cycle and the innovation cycle. So many of the benefits of AI may be slower to arrive, at the very least, as a result of the political cycle, which will result in regulations. Like AI specific regulation, what a completely dumb idea. Regulation of particular products that may cause particular harm. Okay, I can see that in a circumscribed context, but yeah, how do you get to that state? I actually think the Supreme Court, it may be going in that direction, which is good. So there's two elements to it. There's the imposition of regulations by agencies, and under a doctrine called Chevron, there's been deference to the agencies to implement regulations according to how they see fit. That may well change in the next few months as Supreme Court adjudicates a number of cases that relate to that. It's already somewhat constrained it. That doesn't get to the deeper problem, which is the promulgation of legislation itself. That the Supreme Court can, in principle, address that. It can ask whether the legislation itself is constitutional. Whether it will do that, I don't know. That would create potentially a huge fight between different branches of government, between the Supreme Court and the legislative body, and possibly the executive as well, depending on who's in power and what their interests are. But I think more aggressive questioning of the executive and the legislative branch is helpful and can move us hopefully in a positive direction. And if the Supreme Court is able to take that role, then great.
I think I have more faith in the judicial branch than the other two, but we'll see. And because I mean, we're seeing the same kind of challenges in areas outside of AI, right? Like, things like nanotechnology, where companies are moving away from the US due to the hostile regulatory environment that we have here. Are there places in the world that have adopted better frameworks for the development of, AI and other technologies and their implementation than, let's say, the US? And then do those places present a threat to the innovation and economic development in countries that are heavier handed with regulations?
So I'll start by answering the broader question, then give you some analogies. So the broader question is, the answer is there are definitely jurisdictions that have more favorable regulatory environments for some technologies. So in the case of nanotechnology, some of the companies that were based in the US moved to Asia, for example, Singapore, which has a slightly more sympathetic regulatory environment for nanotechnology. Just a little quick lemma here. I was at meetings in the early 90s, at which in Washington, DC, at which some companies that had an interest in nanotechnology were speaking directly to some NGOs who had an interest in regulating nanotechnology. And at that meeting, they agreed to work together. So there you had an explicit Baptist bootlegger coalition formed to push for regulations that would benefit the companies at the expense of smaller, more innovative companies. So what's happened is the smaller, more innovative nanotech companies have ended up moving offshore. in many cases. Another analogy, which is, or not analogy, but an observation that relates to your question as to whether a more aggressive regulation of things like AI in the States is going to ultimately harm the US. So in the late 19th century, the UK government passed what's informally known as the Red Flag Act. This was in the 1860s, I think 1868. Anyway, the Red Flag Act said that this was a time when the motor vehicle was just emerging, but the type of vehicles that were around at that time were steam powered. So it's steam powered cars that were just getting going. And the Red Flag Act said that a vehicle can't travel at more than 4 miles an hour outside of towns, or more than 2 miles an hour in towns. And in towns, the vehicle must have someone walk in front of it carrying a red flag. So 2 miles an hour and carrying a red flag. Well, who do you think the beneficiaries of that act were? Horses and buggies, right? So who were the lobbyists for this act? Horses and buggies, and maybe also the railways. But anyway, horses and buggies and railways. Clearly beneficiaries of this act. Other countries, other jurisdictions didn't impose the same regulation. So where was the internal combustion engine invented? In Germany. And what happened soon after the internal combustion engine was invented in Germany? The UK got rid of the Red Flag Act because it realized at that point that it had lost ground massively, technologically, in terms of the potential for benefiting from this technology to another country. So I think as long as, I mean, the lesson of that, to my mind, is that as long as there remain jurisdictions where it's possible to innovate, the innovations will occur, and ultimately they'll come back to the States. It's just that the States won't benefit nearly as much from developing the innovations, from patenting them, from all of the marketing and so on that goes along with them. They will unfortunately be the recipients of those technologies, merely the recipients. So I say merely, because that being a recipient of a wonderful AI technology is not a bad thing, right? I mean, that most of the benefits are actually going to go to the consumer. So that it's just that the US could do even better if it actually was to allow the technologies with fewer constraints, without I mean, right now the US is not right now implementing a national regulation on this. It's got standards, NTIA standards, which probably not ideal, but they're not. I think they're less harmful than what the EU's done, for example, with its AI Act, which is very prescriptive. You can see the logic in the prescriptions, but it's still very prescriptive, and I think is going to suffer as a result of that. The categorization of harm and so on that it's put in place, that probably doesn't actually match entirely the harms that might result from the implementation of AI.
It's becoming readily apparent that we have to get used to the idea of a well-written program created by non-domain experts supplanting those with perceived subject matter expertise. And we're already seeing this in many innovative products and services, many of which have better design and efficiency and performance compared to what's been designed by experts in the field. So what impact do you see this paradigm having on businesses in the future?
So this is like the $100 billion trillion question, right? So what is the dynamic that's going to play out in different businesses, different industry sectors, as a result of implementing different kinds of AI? What we can see right now is that certain industries are adopting LLMs, large language model based systems, for improving the efficiency of certain activities, so programming, you can, as you said, now you can be a layman effectively and ask one of the Bard or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever to write a program in Rust or whatever programming language you particularly need at that time, and it will do a fairly good job. You may need someone who's a little bit more expert in the language in order to iron out the problems. So what I see happening in that particular case is people who are experts will no longer need so much a team of programmers to develop their full program, because they can get most of the grunt work done by by one of these large language models. Now, in a sense, what the large language models are doing there is what the grunt work programmers were doing before, which is identifying chunks of code and putting it together, right? So this is already how programmers work, is that there'll be enormous amounts of code that's already out there that can be copied and pasted, and grunt programmers are basically doing that. So and I think that applies in other areas too. You can see these language models being used by journalists. You can type in a request to the LLM, and it will come back with a half-formed article. I say half-formed. It's like, because it's written in a sort of slightly stilted manner, and then a journalist can take that and quickly create copy. Much more quickly than they would have been able to previously. So it enhances the ability of people who are already experts, probably crowds out some of the lower level people, which is an issue, because that means that there will be fewer people entering to those professions. And said, well, it's a problem if you see those professions as desirable in themselves. There will probably be fewer programmers, there will be fewer journalists, and each of those people would just be doing more. They'll become more productive. Like in other cases of disruption, what's happening is jobs are being replaced and efficiency is increasing. The question is, what does the new generation of people who might otherwise have become journalists or programmers or actually economists? I mean, it's knowledge workers, as you said. It's knowledge workers as a class are going to, I think, end up becoming more diverse. So what this creates is an opportunity for a wider range of expertise, maybe a wider range of expertise, with each person being narrower in their expertise. So isn't that actually just a continuation of what's been happening for hundreds of years as people become more and more expert in very narrow areas? I think that's the likely outcome, at least in the sort of short to medium term. And I'm talking like the next 20 or 30 years. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't tell you what's going to happen even in that space of time, but it's my guess is that will be the result. There will be casualties. So there will be people who aren't able to adapt, aren't able to shift, aren't able to narrow their focus, so they become narrower domain experts. But there are also opportunities. So the specific opportunities are, you see adverts for them already, people who are prompt engineers. You literally see this, and it's going to be, that'll be narrower now. It'll be prompt engineering for ChatGPT, prompt engineering for Claude, prompt engineering for Bard. So you'll be people who are very specifically expert in prompting these models to give them the results that will be most effective in delivering whatever outcome is desired. So I'm optimistic that this is going to result in increased efficiency, new products, new services, new ways of doing things. That is going to lead to economic growth. It is also going to, as technological revolutions, even incremental innovations always do, lead to some people not being able to adapt and therefore being left by the wayside.
I want to continue on that because I think you were one of the first people I ever heard talking about the subject, and I recall years ago you told me that the difference between past innovation and what we're seeing today is that in a sense there's not necessarily anywhere to go from the knowledge economy, and you talked about knowledge workers, having historically enjoyed the luxury of disrupting the blue collar segments of society, and ultimately we all had tremendous benefit. But the interesting dynamic taking place with AI today is that now the knowledge worker is introducing potentially self-disrupting technology, which could have previously unimagined consequences or outcomes. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this now, just to kind of pick up on what you were saying? And do you see the progression of AI taking a similar course as past innovation, where there are these short-term ramifications, but ultimately long-term benefits for businesses and people alike?
So I think I'll stick by my general observation that, I mean, at least for the short to medium term, that the AI is going to cause, AI is going to enable all sorts of new ways of doing things. I mean, for example, in the area of surgery, you would now be able to have, we already have robotic surgery, remote surgery undertaken by a doctor thousands of miles away using a very sophisticated but remotely operated robot arm. In the future, I see those operations increasingly being done in an automated way. So the remote operation becomes an auto operation. It's an AI that's learned to do the surgery without the need for a human. So what happens next? Well, that means that more people can have those surgeries at lower cost, which saves more lives, which helps people to live better lives. At the same time, the surgeons who were previously doing those operations will have less work. They may shift. Maybe they'll become the people who communicate the need for an operation, who interact between the AI that does the diagnosis and the AI robot that does the operation. They're the person in the middle who explains what the diagnosis is to the patient, and then recommends a particular surgical robot with a particular program for the patient. That also suggests to me, though, that the number of those surgeons is going to fall, because that job is a much less onerous one than one that involves going into the operating theatre and performing the task, which often is not even done by the doctor who's sort of in the middle. So there's going to be disruption. There's going to be disruption across the board. But people, hopefully, it will happen in such a way that most people will be able to adapt. They'll be able to find the different space that they can operate in. They'll be able to be that person who can act as the communicator between the diagnostic AI and the robot AI surgeon. Or they'll find another role that is adjacent to that in some way, shape, or form. That's certainly how things have happened in the past, for the most part. But you can't know for sure. The Chat GPT, Claude, Bard programmer, the person who engineers prompts. I mean, there'll be new jobs, probably many of them, and we can't foresee exactly what those will look like. And when these new technologies have come into existence, there'll be. I mean, so for example, before the internet, before YouTube, really, there wasn't really so much a class of people called influencers. And now, if you ask, teenage kids what they want to be, I want to be an influencer. Like, how is that even a job? right? I mean, realistically, it's a job that can be occupied by a relatively small slither of the population. But the majority of teenagers have seen many of these influencers and seen that they, Mr. Beast is a billionaire or whatever. Wouldn't it be great to be that person? But there will be new classes of job, I suppose, or activity, and then there may, because of the innovations, the cost of everything will fall, right? So, and things will be better and cheaper. So the need to earn vast sums of money in order to live a good life will be diminished. So then the question is, okay, well, will people still be able to earn enough, even if the cost of living has fallen, even if the price of bread starts to fall again, and the cost of living in other respects falls? Will there still be enough to do for humans to do to be able to supply it? And I think you look at places like Etsy, and yes, people are going to people do other stuff. They'll do crafts that they exchange with one another. And the people who do have money because they're doing productive things will buy those things. That's how it's been working. But I'm kind of an optimist, so I would say that. I guess we have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I get it. I just think, from the context of a society where machines are more intelligent than humans, and quantitatively, of course, not in an emotional sense, but AI is obviously having a significant impact, and this is going to take some getting used to. And major innovations previously took 100 years. New ones are now springing up in weeks or months, and it's going to impact every discipline and change the way that we all live in this world. Even before ChatGPT and large language models, AI, deep learning and similar methods had the potential to automate over half of the jobs that exist. And I guess where are we seeing a lot of the the most disruption? How will we deal with at least that short-term job loss, and can we get ahead of this to provide insight and guiding principles and words of wisdom on how AI can effectively commingle and integrate with knowledge workers so disruption is minimized and innovation continues to progress forward?
So I think one way in which humans will be able to adapt to AI and benefit from it more than be a victim of it is by adopting kind of Neuralink type interfaces where we've become sort of part cyborg. I mean, it sounds like a sort of scary scenario, but so there was research done a decade ago by DARPA showing that you could improve the speed with which people learn a new language by using an AI, a machine learning based reinforcement tool that monitored the behavior of the person participating in the learning process by about 80%. Right, so you could really dramatically improve the speed with which people learn a language. That, I think, is going to apply across the board by using these interactive technologies that use monitoring and machine learning. You'll be able to help people get up to speed on tasks that they would otherwise have taken months on in a much, much more compressed time. So I think that's one way that we'll be able to interact with AI, robots, and the plethora of new technologies that will exist in the future in ways that will be beneficial and enable us to adapt better. Because remember, it's about adapting. You've got your job's gone. What are you going to do next? Okay, if there's a technology that can enable me to learn a new task that is much narrower, much more discrete than what I was doing before, but that looks really fulfilling. Yeah, let's do that. Let's learn that and get into that space. And I think we will see. So 100 20 odd years ago, the majority of the workforce, well, let's take it because there's difference between global and US and UK. It's got 150 years ago, the vast majority of people were basically agricultural laborers. There was, let's call it 10 jobs, but it might as well just have been one job. It was somewhat differentiated, but a very limited amount of differentiation, maybe 100 jobs. But for the most part, people were out in the fields, planting, harvesting, and then taking to market. That was what they did, right? I mean, and they wouldn't even have much differentiation. They would, yeah, some people would specialize in one of those more than another. Very, very simple set of tasks at a certain level. No, they were often very expert at it, but it was still quite inefficient. And over time, you've had massive improvements in agricultural efficiency, so that instead of having 90% of the workforce involved with agriculture, now it's about 1%. But at the same time, the number of activities that people can do has multiplied exponentially. And I just don't see that stopping. The activities that people will do will be narrower and more efficient, more beneficial per activity than was the case previously. And they'll be able to do that because of the new technologies that are available to them. Not only large language models and stable diffusions for visual imagery and all of the AIs that we already know about. There'll be new AIs, and there'll be new interfaces between the human and their various cyborgs. Yeah, that's my hope.
Are you going to become a cyborg?
Well, my Facebook image is already a cyborg, so I think I've gone there.
Halfway there. We'll just hit up Elon and
I'm certainly keen to try these technologies as they emerge. Yeah.
So a little different than that, but and maybe a little scarier. But there's this common fear that AI is leading to sentient robots potentially posing an existential threat to humanity, and at the same time, some governments seem intent on using AI to further their authoritarian agenda. For instance, using facial recognition to monitor and control their populations. Are these two sides of the same coin, and what's the best way to address the threat of Skynet?
So barring having an Arnold Schwarzenegger character come back and destroy each technology as it's developed, seems pretty implausible. I think the best approach to address the threat of a single AI essentially controlling the population, or even Skynet, like basically going to war with humanity, is having competing systems. And the most effective way of getting more competition is by laying off the regulation. You get more competition when the market is able to allow many different technologies to coexist than you do if you have a single regulator determining which AIs or which other technologies are permissible. So bottom up is the way to go, and the way to achieve that is by minimal and as parsimonious, abstract, clear, simple, straightforward regulation as possible.
My last question is probably way off subject, but I know you and I both have some, let's say, interest in ESG, and we're both doing some work in that regard from a more, let's say, libertarian perspective. But on one side of it, because I'm wondering your thoughts, right? So on one side, it promotes sustainable practices. It has the potential for long-term value creation and reduced pollution and, other benefits. But on the other side, there are challenges with standardization and greenwashing and compliance. So how do you reconcile these challenges? And do you have any advice for businesses around these kind of sustainable strategies?
It's a tough question. So there was a paper published a couple of years ago showing that certain kinds of ESG investment can paradoxically undermine investments in, for example, low carbon technologies. So if, for example, your ESG fund strategy screens out the companies that are major polluters, major emitters of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, then you won't invest in those companies. To the extent that that dramatically reduces the amounts of investment in those companies, it drives up those companies' costs of capital. Now, some ESG proponents say, well, that's great, we'll make it more expensive then for them to do business, and other business will then thrive. The problem is that the use of fossil fuels is still the main source of energy around the world. Like 90% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. So if you disinvest in companies that are using those fuels, you make it more difficult for them to invest in alternatives. You raise their cost of capital, you literally make it more difficult for them to invest in alternatives. So there's this potential paradox that by using that ESG strategy, you will be slowing down the rate of change of technologies in that particular context. So slowing down the rate at which firms move towards lower carbon emitting technologies. So clearly, if you're going to get involved in ESG, you've got to be mindful of those perverse effects and thoughtful of the ways in which one might actually provide benefits. My view is that probably a vast proportion of innovations that take place today are things that improve efficiency and thereby have environmental benefits. Attempting to classify any particular set of innovations as environmentally beneficial is very challenging. I'll ask you a question. Would you say that the following three technologies were green technologies? So the computer, lasers, and TCP/IP.
Probably not from the sense of what is required from mining to get us to those technologies in the first place.
So I mean, I certainly think that when they were first developed, fourth technology, lasers, right? When these things were first developed, I don't think anybody was thinking, this is a green tech. And even until really they all came together in the form of fiber optic cable delivering information across the planet very, very rapidly at very low cost. At that point, you've got a green technology in some sense, but it wasn't preordained, and it required this serendipitous interaction of several different technologies to come into being. And basically, without the laser, you can't, and fiber optics, you couldn't have. Without the laser and optical fiber cabling, you couldn't have fiber optics. I mean, you couldn't transmit information. Without the computer, you wouldn't have the information to transmit. And without TCP/IP, you wouldn't have a protocol that enables the transmission of that information in a way that's kind of creates redundancy and avoids routing problems, reduces routing problems. So my point is, many things that end up ultimately reducing fossil fuels. I mean, just to take one example, right? So copper cable has a transmission loss of about 94% over distances of over 100 meters. Fiber optic cable has a transmission loss of 3% of distances over 100 meters. copper cable is enormously expensive to produce from raw materials. Fiber optic cable is made from sand. Yeah, you have to heat it up and spin out the fibers, but the amount of resources that goes into fiber optic cable versus copper is tiny. So you've got these enormous resource savings, both in terms of the material that's there and the cost of operating the system. I mean, if you've got these massive losses, signal losses on copper cable, you need more repeaters. You need to use more electricity to power the system. So, getting back to my point, serendipitous interaction of all sorts of innovations is likely to lead to improvements that we can't foresee. So it's interesting to dictate the what is green may well actually impede investments in innovations that would actually be more beneficial.
It's a super interesting point, and I haven't thought about it that way, and I'm glad you brought it up. So, Julian, I very much appreciate your time today. It's been very thought-provoking. Is there anything else you want to mention to our audience before we sign off?
Oh, no, it's just been a great pleasure chatting with you today. And if you're interested in my work, you can probably Google my name, although you might now end up with other Julian Morris, who is unfortunately a more famous movie star than me. But Google my name in association with Reason Foundation or ICLE or something like that, and you'll see some of my stuff. And I welcome everyone's comments on it as well. So yeah.
I totally back that. If there's anybody that you want to study what they've written, this is the guy. So anyway, Julian, thank you for your time, and
thank you, Chris.
We look forward to continuing the conversation
Absolutely.
in the future. Yeah.